Well, welcome, friends. My name is Tamara with Love in a Big World, and this is our LBW Educate You podcast. Today, my guest is Shani Dowell of Possip. She is fabulous, and I'm so proud that she is another female entrepreneur here in Nashville doing great things in education. Welcome, Shani. Would you tell us a little bit about you and what you're up to these days?
Yeah, thanks, Tamara. So great to connect and yes, share the excitement for female founders, particularly in education. So I about 4 years ago founded Possip, and really what we want to do is to strengthen schools and communities through the power of voices, specifically parents, caregivers, and staff. Um, and part of kind of how we do that is using technology, so giving parents and staff an opportunity to respond to text message prompts to share what's going well, what their needs are, what feedback they have, what ideas they have. And so we do that through a multilingual platform, and then allow school administrators and district leaders to get that information and take action. So
That's awesome. Well, I'm excited to learn more about your work and also about your perspective on social emotional learning. Today,
yeah.
friends, we are looking at the role of parent and caregiver partnership in building the social and emotional health of parents. So we understand that parents are a key driver in children's mental health. So tell us a little bit more. Can the SEL health of kids be separated from the SEL health or the social emotional learning health of families?
Wow, that's such a good and kind of deep question. So I think of it, so kind of the question, there are kind of two lenses. One is like, can a child social emotional health and development go on a different path, for example, than a parent social emotional health and development? And then the second is, can schools develop social emotional health for kids without parents being in alignment? I think it's, for both answers, I would say it's possible to separate the two. I don't think it's the best path or the easiest path. And so I'll share a little bit more. So me as a parent, for sure, I want my kids' development to be separated from like where I am. So like if I'm struggling, I hope that they are getting tools where they can, even if I'm struggling where they're not, that would be my hope. The reality is every day they come home to me. So whatever state I'm in does have an impact on them. The good part about social emotional teaching and development at school is potentially if I'm a person who's affecting their social emotional health, at least they have the tools to cope or to kind of deal with or to think about or to express how they're feeling about how I'm behaving. That's on the good side. But the best ideal is that parents and schools are aligned on the development of social emotional health and practices. I was thinking about this, and unlike math or English, it's rare that parents are going to provide, like, parents aren't going to teach you a different, like, that addition's not, that that there's not addition. They're not going to teach you that there's not, not to read. There are some tools in social emotional learning where parents might actually have a different thought, or like how they were raised might be different than like, what we're teaching. So a good example that I would think about is like, what do you talk about? Like, do you talk about things that you're struggling with in your family? So people with, both my mom's a therapist, my sister's a therapist. So I say that I kind of come from a strong background of where you talk about things, you process your feelings, and that's really important. Some parents may not think that that's important. And so I think it's important to bring parents along on the journey. So if part of what we're teaching schools is that we do think it's important for kids to be able to process what they're feeling, what they're thinking about, whether it's through writing or talking to another person, how can we bring parents along on that journey? They may not always agree, that may not be their shared experience, but when possible, how do we help parents come along on the journey alongside their kids so that they can reinforce some of those same messages, as opposed to us kind of being in battle with different ideologies or philosophies on developing social emotional health. I mean, do parents even all value social emotional health? Is that like a thing that's, and so I think that that's something, I think we all assume that everyone, yes, thinks that social emotional health should exist and matter. But if we start with a point like maybe not everyone does agree with that, then we start thinking about, okay, what would it take to bring parents along or families or caregivers along on that journey about why it matters, how it's going to help their kids be more safe, be more academically successful, be emotionally successful, choose a great partner, if they choose to have a life partner, like whatever they want to do. How do we see all of these things kind of shaping that? And I think we often operating with the assumption that, oh, of course, everyone agrees with this. So yeah, those are just some of my thoughts.
So you mentioned a couple things. You're looking at this whole journey of social emotional health for kids from the lens of an educator as well as a parent.
Mm-hmm.
So how old are your kids?
10 and 7. So a rising 6th grader and a rising 3rd grader.
Okay, so you've got lots of experience under your belt.
Mm-hmm.
And how does that experience as both a parent and an educator shape or frame the work that you do with social and emotional health?
Well, and the other lens that we have is, so through our platform, we have about 400,000 parents in that platform who are sharing their ideas, their needs, their feedback with almost 700 schools across the country. So having some insight from that as well. And so I think what that does for me, both as a parent, like you said, an educator, as well as a person who just gets to see the perspective of lots of parents, is when I see the importance of it. Like when parents understand that their kids need social emotional health, they understand it deeply. Like they understand, like when their kid is wrestling with depression or feelings of isolation or being bullied or just demotivated. So I can see the depth of need, like when it's clear that it exists. But I've also seen examples of parents feeling like they don't really understand what's happening, or like potentially what's being taught is not like aligned with what they perceive their own family values as. And so I've seen some of that tension as well. And then I've also just seen when they're just real needs, that families just have real needs that they need to, that they want to express, kind of at the food, transportation, technology level, where sometimes something like social emotional health can feel higher on the kind of on the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Like it's like not something that they're necessarily thinking about because they're still thinking about, oh, I need food. So those are a couple of the different lenses that I see them through. But it's interesting as a parent seeing my kids return to school. And I think my kids probably went through something similar that I went through when my kids returned to school. I think people kind of are familiar with the idea of like sometimes when you go on a vacation or if you get to a holiday and your body just kind of like shuts down. It's like, okay, like I can shut down now. And so you kind of sometimes will get sick. When my kids went back to school, I reached this point where I was like, I am burnt out. Like I just finally like hit the, like, I am burnt out. But I think it's because my body was finally saying like, all right, you've endured this year, you've made it through, you've tried to keep a happy face on this whole time. And so then like all the things came back. And I actually think something similar happened with my kids where I realized like, oh, they're all of the ways in which they were saying they were okay, they potentially weren't okay. And how are we creating a space for them to express that and for them to then determine the skills they need to adjust to that. And so it became something that felt maybe, I don't think I realized how important it was in the moment. It was almost like after the moment that I realized. And I think that's sometimes a challenge for social emotional health and wellness. It's like, you need it before you know you need it. Like kids need the skills and the tools before they're manifesting what you would know as a parent or even a school leader that they have the need for. And so it's kind of tricky. And I just realized that a lot of it is in having a space, like a carved out space for conversation and for reinforcing messages and tools and skills. So anyway, so those are just a few of my thoughts.
So this is so good, Shani. You mentioned too this tension between families that may be very private about what's happening in their lives, and then this different approach of processing, talking it out. I was caught by that because I had a conversation with my mom a couple weeks ago when I went up to visit her in Pittsburgh, and there's some family stuff going on, and that was one of the points of tension in our conversation. Like, Mom, I think that your generation is a lot more private than my generation. Like, we want to talk about it and we want to process. And so my kids, who are now 23, 18, and 15, like I've taught them all along, like, let's talk through this. It's okay to feel how you feel. If you're angry, if you're sad, if you're but let's talk about it. Don't just keep it bottled up. Let's process through. And that really is a different way of thinking for a lot of people.
Yeah. And I think it's, one of the beautiful parts about so many of the districts that I know you all work with, that we work with, is they are diverse districts, meaning they represent diverse cultures. And we know that that's even a culture, like different cultures have different preferred ways of operating. And so it's like holding those ideas like that, how everyone operates is valuable and valued. And we're not trying to replace how people operate. We're just trying to introduce new ways or new tools or things that, but I think that kind of underlines why it's so important to bring families along on the journey. So they can understand the why or the experience behind it and make choices themselves. Because at some point, so for example, to your point, like, so my mom is a therapist. She definitely came from, her parents were more of like, you don't share. At some point, she gathered some set of information that led her to want to share more openly about, her struggles, and, encouraged us to, like I said, she would never say that she was a perfect parent, but she did always let me feel like there was a way that I could express whatever I was feeling, or like how I was experiencing things. And so I think just giving people the opportunity to learn about that and to be able to be on the journey with their kid or with their family or with the school is really important. Again, people may not choose to, they may still think like, no, we keep these things private, but at least they've had the opportunity to understand why someone else might be encouraging their child to talk openly or to process their feelings. I was talking to a cousin of mine she's a social worker, and she was at the playground, and she was she was kind of observing, and one of the parents was getting really angry at her child for having dirt in her hair, and so my cousin was like, oh, that's too bad, kids should be able to play and just like explore, and not be worried about necessarily having dirt in their hair, which might be our values and what we kind of think. And maybe that parent could also, like, if the parent had the same set of information that my cousin had about the values of like playing in nature and all that stuff, might be able to also understand. But I think we assume that everyone has the same set of information that we have, and we don't. And so I think that's part of the real opportunity with social emotional learning, is like, how do you make it not just a student thing, but a family thing?
Mm-hmm. So what are some of the tools that kids need in order to navigate their social and emotional health and wellness?
These are some of my personal opinions, and it's interesting. I wrote a blog recently on our site about the empathy gap, because when we opened up, I went and visited my parents because we hadn't visited them in a while, and so as I watched my kids talk to older adults, I was like, oh my gosh, like, they haven't done this in a year. They haven't like seen the world through someone else's eyes. They haven't like gotten the wisdom of elders, and so I definitely think having other adults for them to talk to outside of just their parent is super important, just because it helps them meaning make and have perspective take. And so I think having other adults is huge, other trusted adults. And it also just teaches them that there are other people that are safe. Trusted adults. Reading, I think, is so critical, because again, they can like see that it's a way to see the perspective of others without having to like talk a lot. It's kind of like a safe way to explore the world. So we're big on that. And then writing, I think, is also really important. So I know my daughter, whenever she's like frustrated or angry with this, she'll write. And recently, when she returned to school, and she was like, she was kind of feeling like nervous. She was trying to figure out, well, what's the difference between being nervous versus anxious. And so we talked a little bit about some of the differences. And I told her, I said, when I'm like kind of anxious, but I can't figure out why, I like to do a free write. So like, let's just sit down here for 10 minutes, and we're going to just start with like the sentence starter. I might be nervous about ... And so we sat down, and we kind of like, and she was like, she couldn't, like, the idea of free write was a little bit hard for her. So, she was like, well, like, I keep getting distracted. I was like, okay, write about the thing that you're distracted about. Just like wherever your mind takes you, that's the spirit of free write, is you just write it down. But I think that's really, I do think, so reading, writing, and talking to others, I think, is super helpful. And then I think, to connect to your work, I do think having a framework through which they are thinking about these things is super helpful. Like, we talk a lot in our organization about like shared vocabulary. So being able to have names to put to feelings or examples or a framework, I think, is super helpful as they do things like write and try to process the world that they're seeing.
And what about parents? What are some of the tools that they need to navigate?
I'll start on the opposite. And I do think like shared vocabulary is really helpful. Like, how do you put names to things? Like, you think about being a baby, as you're learning how to navigate the world, one of the first things you're trying to learn is like, what do you call things? So I do think teaching us how to like name emotions and giving us a wider vocabulary. I think about this a lot as a teacher. sometimes how, especially when you see this a lot more with the younger kids, when they don't have the words to articulate what they're feeling. And that's really hard. And that's why sometimes kids manifest that in ways like throwing things but it's like, how do you help parents have a wide vocabulary around feelings? So I think that's certainly one thing. Something that's harder, I don't think we quite have the structures for that yet. Like I know like a lot of districts have things like parent university. I think those things tend to be logistically good. I still think it's so hard to like, one, get parents to attend that, and two, have the trust where like you're ready to trust someone else to help you navigate, certain paths. I mean, again, as a parent, I see this myself. It's so hard, like especially as my daughter enters adolescence, and my husband and I are both educators. I come from a family of therapists, and I still am like pulling out all my tricks and tools to navigate this time. But I do think having, for other parents, I think having a trusted adult that they can talk to and process some of these things with and normalize or denormalize. And I know I have like lots of friends I do that with, where I'm like, hey, my kid's doing this. Is this normal? Is this date? And I do a lot of reading myself. So kind of same stuff actually that I was recommending for kids, like shared vocabulary, reading, writing, and then having other trusted adults. And that's both like my parents, because, in our minds, like I'm laughing because my daughter, I got a call from school. She was laughing in class, and it's funny. Of course, like my parent, I'm like, oh my gosh, like, what are you doing? And then I'm like thinking back, oh, well, when I was in 6th grade, I got a U in conduct, and I got kicked off the bus, and like all the things that I did and my 6th grade self, that sometimes when you talk to your parents, they remind you of those things, or you talk to others, they can remind you of like how life just kind of like unfolds. But I think when you're in that moment as a parent, you kind of like think like, oh my gosh, this is the first child ever who's gotten a phone call home from school, and so I just think that helps. Having a community really helps.
So what can schools do to hear parents' needs as they're
Yeah,
navigating, their own social and emotional needs, as well as their kids' social and emotional health needs, particularly during these times of
yeah. Well, I mean, of course, I'm biased. I do, part of why I created Possip was understanding that for parents, um, there's so much coming at them. And so it's really hard to triage all of the things that are coming at the parent. And so often what happens for parents is they don't realize that they have an issue or a need until it's gotten really acute, until they're feeling that pain point really badly. And so part of Possip's intention in being a routine text prompt that happens as often as weekly is to allow parents to understand for themselves, to get prompted for themselves, like, oh, yes, I do have a need. So I think one of the main things schools can do, and Possip is a tool to do this, but really schools can do this anyway, it's just to ask, like have a system through which you're asking parents and families, what do you need? Families don't always know, like it's kind of like, sometimes you don't know until it happens, but at least once you've asked and they know that you care, so that when they do have the need, they articulate it. I do think it's important to ask that in multiple ways. So you might have someone at the school who's calling. A lot of schools and districts did a really great job of this, where they, like MNPS, Metro Nashville Public Schools, created a navigators program where they have an adult who's calling. So that's really great. One of the things we've seen through Possible, we've heard from our partners, is that sometimes parents, they like the more anonymity of a text, where they don't have to like reveal something to a person, but they can just put in a text and then have someone follow up with them. So I think having multiple paths through which parents can share their needs is really important. And then following up, and make sure that they know someone's going to follow up and help take care of those needs. Parents do need quite a bit of help just trying to navigate their own child. And I know that's hard because, for schools are really already taking on a lot with just trying to do like kind of academic education, and then social emotional health. But I think parents still need some help about, motivating their kid, especially during this time. It's something we see parents asking a lot about, like, how do I motivate my child during this time? How do I get them off screen time all the time? So, how do I make sure that they're using social media appropriately? How do I get them to bed on time? There's so many questions. And, one of the things I've observed just when I look at what some more resource schools offer, is they do bring in a lot of outside speakers to help parents understand how to do those things. Like they'll bring in experts in certain, like child psychologists and experts, to help schools and parents know how to navigate that. And I think that's something that's super helpful to do.
So how do you think that the role of the school has changed for kids and families given the past year that we've all lived through together?
Have you seen change? Well, I think the past year in some ways highlighted, I'm trying to put this politely, how unreasonable our expectations have been of what we ask schools to do. When the pandemic hit, and then schools and districts were having to figure out not only, well, I should say, particularly public schools in cities, they were not only having to figure out, okay, how do we academically support and teach kids, but how do we get them food? How do we get them technology? How do we make sure that they know about what the health options are in terms of getting tested? 3 out of 4 of those things are not like the primary function of schools. And when you looked at more affluent schools, they weren't having to take on those other 3 things. Social and emotional health and character development, I think, are always part of school. I think sometimes we think of it as a new thing, but when you really think about a big purpose of the school, it is the development of the entire child. And sometimes I think we've swung the pendulum where maybe schools have gotten away from that, but I think that's always been central. I've heard it described really beautifully as like the yin and the yang, where it's like through the content development, you're helping students develop the character to then be able to pursue more academic content. So like the character and social emotional health goes hand in hand with the academics. But we've asked schools to do so much more than that. And it's a lot, and we don't resource them significantly more to do that. And we don't support and develop them significantly differently to do that. And so I think that this year really, I feel like, put a focus on that. What we're asking schools and teachers to do is just a lot. My hope is coming out of this year, I definitely have seen an increased appreciation for the inability to extract parents from kids. So, I think sometimes in education, I think because, I was like this as a teacher too, where you really are just so driven to help your students succeed. You're kind of like you sometimes think that you can do everything. And I think the reality came that on both sides, like parents appreciated, oh, we need teachers. And I think teachers appreciated, oh, we need parents and caregivers to be able to help students succeed. And so I think that's going to remain. I'm hopeful that that'll remain. I'd like to build the bridge to continue to strengthen, because I think at times what can appear if you use social media as your guide, it can appear that those 2 groups are not aligned. What we see through parent feedback and family feedback is that families and staff actually are quite aligned. Like when parents shared, most of what they share is praise for teachers and staff. They even, like, sometimes they're asking questions like, how are we keeping our teachers safe? So they really care. And then sometimes the things that they're asking for are actually the same things. And so just keeping in mind that families and parents, families and staff often are on the same page, but sometimes just how our systems work can feel like they're not.
So I'm curious about a couple things. When you're describing this new set of responsibilities that have become the schools have taken ownership of it. It reminds me a lot of that community school approach. That schools are really the center of our communities now. And maybe in some ways, some of these responsibilities would have been picked up by faith-based organizations. But a lot of it the onus has been on the schools, particularly last year. Would you agree?
Yeah.
Yeah. And then the other thing that I'm wondering about is just how do you're describing that parents and teachers are often on the same page, but yet there's this misconception. So where does that misconception come from? And then how can we help bridge the gap so that we can all present as we're on the same team, and the team is Team Kid. Like we're all for the success of our children.
That's such a great question. Where does it come from? I think this is why I've created the Possip, because I think a lot of times the most vocal voices are the ones who are not necessarily on the same page, or they feel like their only outlet is to be publicly vocal about what they're not happy with. When there are lots of people who are either happy or just, really generous in terms of how they see the challenges, but those people aren't like as likely to be public. So I think we have to get the messages out there from people who are, you know, and they'll share their praise. And I think that's what schools and districts are often surprised by, to see like how many positive things families have to say. But I think giving both of those groups the opportunity to share what's on their mind and for them to be able to see what they're sharing. And that's what we have the opportunity to see, where we can see like, oh, your families were sharing about this need, your staff were sharing about the same need. I think education is so complex that sometimes it's hard to know, you know, like a recent example is TN Ready here in our state of Tennessee, where the state said that students needed to come in person to take the TN Ready test. That created a lot of pressure because schools had to be the ones to implement that. So then families might assume like, oh, this is because the school is making us do this, when that could be something that's coming from the state, or it could be something coming from the federal government. Like, it's just so complicated and so hard for anyone to know like what the different groups are having to deal with in terms of the pressure that's being put on them. And so I don't have an easy solution, but I do think if we can get the praise and the positive stories out there more, then that'll help create the space so that when there is conflict or when there is challenge, they trust that they trust each other. And I think that that's the best that we can probably do.
Yeah, I think that trust is key, because you can't really hear each other or institute positive change unless there's trust.
Yes. Yeah. And I think once schools get to hear like, oh, our families really love us, they value us, they want the best, then when they're saying like, hey, can you add this or we need that, then it's not like, oh, you're doing this because you hate us. It's just like, oh, you love us and you just want us to be better or be different or you just need this. And that's not like, you're not mad at us, you just have this need. And so I think that's really important and powerful.
And I think too, one of the things you said about the complexity of the educational system, it's important to demystify that. So parents don't feel that there's this adversarial relationship between me versus the school, and then the child is the pawn in between. It's like, no, there's a whole lot more people making decisions that impact our children and impact our families on a daily basis. And I think for me, that's one of the things that became even clearer over this year of COVID, was interconnectedness of all these processes and systems and governmental entities. I mean, that it's not just a kid going to school.
Right.
There's all these other people that are involved in that, and how that impacts family life too.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's definite. And I think parenting, it's definitely the hardest job that I've ever had. You know,
and we accelerated it this year. We put it on like, turbo speed this year.
Yeah, the internal and external factors of each individual child. And it's a lot. But I so appreciate the work that you're doing, Shani, in giving parents a voice, giving families and caregivers a voice, because we talk so much, especially in the realm of social, emotional health and wellness, about student voice. And sometimes I think we forget about family voice and how important that is.
And it's, you know, one of the things we see, and we're at time, but and it's challenging because a lot of families, unfortunately, have had a history of not having voices or not having their voices valued, not only just as parents, but like before. So you think about our students now who may not feel like they have agency or voice, and then they become parents and also are even expecting it. And so how do we help them kind of know that like you are justified, you are entitled, share what's on your mind. And so that's part of the work that we also think a lot about.
So closing thoughts for us, Shani.
Well, I just love, thank you for creating this space, and thank you for the work that you're doing to just enable students and their families to develop the skills and tools to process their lives. And, you know, what an important time with all that is happening in our world. And it's, you know, and I think sometimes we thought like, oh, coming out of COVID, things are going to like magically, but we just have new things to process and work through. So yeah, thanks for the work you're doing.
Well, thank you. And I'm always eager for more conversations to see. I think more than ever, we need to find ways to collaborate, not just our organizations, but everyone in education, everyone in community. We're all after the same goal, and that is for the healthy development of our children and families. So let's just keep the conversation going.
Let's do it.
Well, thank you so much.